A very warm welcome to Science and Technology Teaching in the Foundation Phase, LSK3701. This would be your third presentation that you would have to listen to. I am your lecturer, Mrs. A Carrim, and you can email me on ecarrier1@unisa.ac.za. Again, I would just like to remind you that the Teaching and Learning platform is my UNISA Moodle platform. This is where you can interact with me as your lecturer through forums. There's also a private chat that's situated on the top of your module site. Just remember, no communication from private accounts, meaning Gmail accounts or any other accounts. This is in line with the POPI Act, and remember, this actually protects your own privacy. So please try to cooperate in this regard. This was also discussed in the previous presentations. To begin with the end in mind, meaning start from the first learning unit and work your way up to the last unit to have a good, full understanding of this module. Assessments, I'm just going to briefly say that you need to do assignment 1, assignment 2. The assignment 1 is your MCQ, your quiz. Assignment 2, your written assignment, and I'm sure all of you are busy with your assignment 2, as it's very important that you guys start now so that you don't not have your assignment ready to submit on the due date. Your online examination will take place in September, October, and this would constitute 80% of your year mark. of the mark, and your year mark would be 20%. So just remember this. Keep it in mind, especially when you're doing these assignments. I see many of you have not submitted. This will affect your year mark and obviously affect your final mark. Application of knowledge. This is the level of questioning that you expect to get in this module. Remember that this is a level, the NQF level 7. So you will get more level 5 and 6 questions, which will count about 50% of your exam, and 3 and 4 will count about 40%. And obviously your remembering and understanding would only constitute 10% of your exam. I will not touch on this as we have introduced the LSK3701 in the previous presentations, but please refer to the previous presentations if you'd like a reminder on the purpose of this module. Study materials, just a reminder, your tutorial letters and your LSK3701 study guide is very, very important. There's no prescribed textbook for this module, but the LSK3701 study guide is very thorough, giving you activities, self-assessment questions. All of this will form a good understanding of this module. The module is divided into 2 sections. We're going to be on Learning Unit 3 today, which is part of the Science Education Section A module, part. And Section B would be your Technology Education, which would constitute Learning Unit 4 to 6, which we'll get to. And I hope you guys have started going through these learning units, especially for Assignment 1 submission. Okay, so let's look at Learning Unit 3. It's planning for science, teaching, and assessment. This is a very important learning unit, and I should hope that all of you have done Learning Unit 1 and 2 and are ready to get into this module. Okay, so Learning Unit 3 is basically developing learning using the curriculum as a starting point. So approaches to teaching science to young learners, the daily lesson planning for inquiry-based theme planning, and your assessment for science learning. Okay, so on completion of this learning unit, you should be able to analyze and compare the different teaching approaches such as inquiry, integration of mathematics, language and creativity, and a cultural historical perspective. So remember, you're identifying suitable contexts for the application of these approaches, and you're suggesting ways in which these approaches can be used successfully in a foundation phase classroom. You need to use examples to cite the use of approaches, appropriate to the learning context, and compile reports which demonstrate the ability to design your own practice based on known teaching theories. Develop theme plans. Theme plans are very, very important. You will see in your assignment 2, I've instructed you to use a specific theme plan, and obviously interpret that in terms of applying your knowledge of learning theories and demonstrating an understanding of the integration of science and technology through theme planning. You need to apply your understanding of the assessment of science learning in the foundation phase as well. Okay, so when we're talking about this learning unit, remember the aim of this learning unit is to actually introduce you to a few approaches of teaching science to young learners. And you will be expected to analyze the different teaching approaches for their suitability to teach for scientific literacy. While you will be introduced to several teaching approaches, you will only be shown how to plan for teaching and learning based on inquiry. I think you can understand this from the previous chapters as well, when we talked about teaching science through inquiry. And the theoretical aspects of the first two learning units actually underpin the how-to of planning science activities and assessing learners to determine their knowledge and understanding of science content, their science process skills, and their actual understanding of the nature of science. So let's look at this. This is the focus of assessment in teaching of science in terms of the process skills, conceptual understanding, and understanding of nature of science. So all of this forms part of the assessment practices. So you need to note that learners develop from these process skills, comparing, classifying, all of that we discussed in the previous learning unit, and learners' understanding of the scientific concepts, how we took them from a naive understanding to a more constructive understanding of the science concepts, learners' understanding of the general nature of science. So this forms part of what you're trying to assess. Okay, so in the next sections, we will discuss how to plan science teaching, in relation to a theme based on a topic found in the, obviously you need to look at the CAPS curriculum, the life skills in the foundation phase, where you can see the different topics that you can, teach within the science and technology subject content. Okay, so you're going to decide, you have to understand when going through these chapters, it is very important to start asking yourself questions and start answering those questions with understanding. So what are the two curricula that focus on how science must be taught and what must be taught? Remember the NCS, the Natural Sciences, South Africa 2002, and the CAPS Life Skills for Foundation Phase, South Africa 2011. These are very important documents that you need to get familiar with, especially as a teacher in the foundation phase. These become like basically the foundation and the guideline to what takes you through teaching the subject in the foundation phase. So what is the NCS document? It basically describes the learning activities applicable to scientific investigations. And this document refers to learning activities, as assessment standards, and in the first and only learning outcome for the foundation phase. You need to get very familiar with this. What does the CAPS curriculum require teachers to teach? Now, you need to go into detail with this. You need to understand that learners have to learn about the topic of, for instance, dissolving substances in water. In teacher-centered lesson, a teacher might demonstrate how different substances, such as sugar and salt, dissolve in water, how sand does not dissolve in water, dissolve in water, but floats on the top of liquid. All of these things are very important. Actually, it's the oil that, that doesn't dissolve in water, but sand does. So this is very important for you to do these experiments in front of the learner, where they get to understand it in a very broad way, where they get to see things and they get to understand it. So also you need to know what are the assessment standards in the NCS Natural Science describe. You need to learn all of this, basically work through the life skills document. This is where you get more understanding and more knowledge on how to work with this document. So remember, ask yourself these questions. What does the CAPS curriculum require teachers to teach? What does the assessment standards in the NCS Natural Sciences describe? And you need to look, according to the CAPS curriculum, what is the best way to teach grade R learners about the topic of dissolving substances, like I said, in terms of sand, in terms of oil, and what should learners in grade R do? And what should they do in different grades? This is very important for you to look through the document and understand. Okay, so we're looking at approaches to teaching science to young learners. So remember, this is also very important very important section that you need to understand and be able to work through this. What does the IBSE stand for? You need to go through, I think it's 3.3.2, that section. In terms of teachers develop science activities and themes with certain objectives in mind. Remember, the main objective of science activities is to develop scientific literacy in learners. And that does not mean that teachers will be able to motivate learners to learn from science activities. Teachers should realize that learners see an activity from their own perspective. Remember, in terms of teachers need to develop an understanding of every single learner's social situation of development. Remember, every learner in the class is different. They have different social situations, different social contexts, and how this interacts with the demands of what has to be done in the activity. Only then actually will teachers be able to facilitate learning through an activity, because they will understand that in terms of how learners are able to interact within their classroom activity. So this is basically the cultural historical perspective of learning in a quite complex way, So in a science class, remember, learners will acquire scientific literacy, culture of science, skills and values through their motivation to take part in science activity. So although their actions, the learners, basically, they get influenced not only what happens during the science activity, but also their own learning of science. So the science class is a social setting, in which the learner's personal motives and competence are realized, and when the activities meet the requirements of science learning. So remember, different learners in the same class who are doing the same activity can experience different social situations. A learner's experience and activities are actually dependent on how he or she understands the requirements of science activity and his or her ability to reflect and generalize these requirements. So basically, this is dependent on the learner's motives and their demands of a situation. So every learner in the same activity setting has a different understanding of the activity setting and has different motives, Remember, there's always tensions and conflicts between demands in an activity setting, and learners' intentions and their motives may lead to learning and development. So every learner learns differently. So learners not only meet the demands of the activity, the teacher and the classmates or group mates, but also put demands on others in their everyday activity settings. So the activities reflect how they integrate these demands. Learners of different ages put different demands on their classmates and their teachers. Sometimes a teacher needs to use different resources and, go far beyond what's written in the textbook. They need to find out the social context of the school they're in or the community they're in and bring this into the classroom. You may need to read, this explanation a few times before you fully understand it and what the cultural historical perspective entails. It's very important that you go through this in depth and develop a good understanding of all of this as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at the approaches to teaching science to young learners. So you need to ask yourself, what does the IBSE stand for? So remember, this is the inquiry-based science education. So it is regarded as an inspiring way of teaching science because it focuses on learners' interests and it stimulates active learning by enabling learners to conduct, their own investigations. So remember, the IBSE has a positive influence on learners' motivation to learn science. And it allows learners to develop an understanding of scientific concepts and, inquiry process skills and the nature of science, all of this that we've learned in the previous learning units. So the Open IBSE specifically allows learners to conduct self-designed, interest-guided inquiry to answer their own questions. And in Open IBSE, teachers fulfill the role of facilitators, supporting and supervising their learners during learning activities. This is what you as a foundation phase learner will find yourself in. So in this section, we basically describe a few approaches to teaching science to young learners, particularly with respect to young learners' development of the process skills, conceptual change in young learners and young learners' ideas about the nature of science. So it's recommended that you revise, the previous discussion that we had in Learning Unit 1 and the descriptions of the process skills and that help to develop learners' understanding of the nature of science that was discussed in Learning Unit 2. So do you see how everything integrates and everything relates to each other so that you can have a better understanding and a more, you're able to apply your knowledge in a better way. Now we look at the 4 domains of scientific understanding that should be addressed during the open IBSE in terms of conceptual, nature of science, social, and procedural domains. So remember, the conceptual domain is basically learners need conceptual knowledge, regarding the topic under the investigation in order to perform an inquiry process. So you can't expect them not to have that conceptual knowledge. The lesson tends to get affected when this is, the case. And then when you look at the nature of science domain, so learners need to think about what scientific knowledge is and how it is developed by scientists. And then you look at the social domain. Learners need to be given an opportunity to talk to their groups about their own understanding of the topic being investigated. I do understand that teachers tend to avoid group work because, they feel that it's too much admin or it wastes too much time. But this is very important to get our learners to become social. This will obviously benefit them in bigger grades and, in debates and things like that are to come. This is where we start the foundation of creating these opportunities for them to talk, for them to address their understanding and, just to communicate and be confident. Procedural domain, learners need to develop the process skills during an inquiry, as well as the skill of using scientific knowledge. So remember, the 4 domains reflect aspects of science that should be addressed when the phases of inquiry-based science learning are planned. And there are different ways of planning the phases of an inquiry-based cycle of learning. So you may come across a 5-phase cycle, but we will focus on the 7-phase cycle. That's very important in your lesson plan, that you will be tested on in your assignment, in your exam. So which explains each phase of the 7-phase cycle. So you can see there, the 7-phase cycle based on the learning cycle is divided into 7 phases. So that is your introduction, your exploration, designing an investigation, conducting an investigation, your conclusion, your presentation, / communication, and deepening / broadening. So we need to understand all of this, the linking between the 7-phase inquiry-based learning cycle. And, the assessment standards of the South African curriculum used in using this diagram. So remember, there are a lot of times where I notice that students don't understand how to integrate this 7-phase inquiry-based learning cycle into their lesson plan. I get a lot of questions in terms of how do we do this, So firstly, it's very important to, to go through each one and to understand what each one expects of you. So introduction, remember, the goal of this phase is to basically confront learners with a problem connected to the real world situation, to excite their curiosity and to increase their understanding of the nature of science. And then when we look at exploration, the goal of this phase is to connect the real world situation to learners' prior knowledge, of the topic under investigation. So the teacher can show videos. At this point, you can show a video about a real world situation and learners can do a reading assignment about the situation. So this is how you get them to understand the context of the lesson. So the teacher can ask, you can ask learners to question about their understanding of the situation, and you can develop a concept map, to give the learners an opportunity to show their initial understanding. Remember, I did discuss this in the previous presentations that you should not, ignore the initial understanding of a situation, of a concept. This is how we build on that. So the learners can give ideas about what else they would like to know about a real world situation, and perhaps on a wonder wall, you can have a wonder wall in your class. Foundation phase classrooms are usually colorful. They usually, are so inviting for our young learners. So please consider all of this, whether it's usually the case where a foundation phase teacher stays in one classroom. So it gives you that flexibility to create this classroom that's full of wonder, full of curiosity. It makes it so much more exciting to learn in. So designing an investigation. So this phase focuses on formulating research questions, composing a research plan, and constructing or collecting instruments for measurement. So the teacher should explain the criteria of a proper investigation. And the learners should work in groups. Remember, I said group work is so important, for social skills. So they can be given opportunity to design their investigation, and the groups, may have different investigations. So you can have group A that does this investigation and come and present in the front and tell them what they found, group B, and so forth. So this creates that excitement. They all feel responsible to explain a certain thing that they investigated, and it becomes a very exciting classroom to be in. Remember, you are a foundation phase teacher. You need to bring that excitement for our young learners. Conducting the investigation. So this phase focuses on data collection. The teacher helps the learners to make correct measurements and to take notes. Data handling is very important for learners to understand, and it becomes much more complex in other grades. So this is the first point of working with data handling. So the teacher should engage the learners in explaining and reflecting on the investigative procedure. So, after they do investigation, they need to reflect and they need to understand, like, what did we find, and start understanding the whole purpose of the investigation. Conclusion: learners must connect the data to their research questions and realize that the results, in terms of the observations and measurements. I know I'm explaining it in a complex way, but remember, our students are young. We need to value their opinions about the different understandings. They should be asked to explain their opinions, and again, reflect on what they found or what they researched about. When we talk about presentation and communication, after learners groups carried out their investigations and drawn conclusions, they must communicate their results, in a clear, comprehensible way by means of presentations, posters, videos, or creative drama. So this is where you bring language, English, into your natural science classroom. This is where you develop those skills so they can present, so they can use posters. So teachers' roles here is to facilitate learners' reflection on the results and how to best present them. So remember, the learners can carry out a self or peer assessment. The teacher can assess the presentations too. So the notes, you'll see the learner can make their own notes in their science journals, and that would remove the social element of the phase. When you talk about deepening and broadening, remember, during this phase, the learners reflect on the inquiry process, which deepens their understanding of the topic. So the teacher would basically return to the concept map and either make a new map to reflect the learner's new understanding or make notes on the first concept map. So, you just add on to that concept map. So the class should basically return to the wonder wall. I would recommend that you have a wonder wall in your classroom and reflect on these questions that they wondered about and how they now been answered, and what would they still like to inquire into, So these reflections make you understand what would they like to know more about that topic.